Next, retiring Indiana Congressman Dan Burton talks about his career in Congress after serving 15 terms. He currently serves on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and he was its chair from 1997 to 2002. This is about half an hour.
Indiana Congressman Dan Burton retiring after 30 years in the House of Representatives. You hear so often people making the comment, Congress is broken today. As you exit the institution, how would you say its state is?
I think it's changed a great deal. I don't think it's the same as when I first came in 1983. There seemed to be more comedy back then. Tip O'Neill was the speaker. Never will forget the first time I was on the floor raising Cain with the Democrats. Tip was in the speaker's chair, and he had somebody take his place, and he came down and started giving me the Dickens. And but after that, we became very good friends, played golf together. Bob Michael was a wonderful leader. And so I think there was a spirit of camaraderie, even though we had differences politically then that we don't have now. Now it's much more combative. I have a lot of friends on the Democrat side of the aisle, very good friends. But as far as working things out, it's not nearly as easy as it used to be.
What are some of the root causes of that, do you think?
I think that, and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but I remember when we went after Senator or Congressman Wright, Jim Wright, who was the Speaker. Newt led the charge on that, and it became very combative, and Jim was forced out of office. And then they went after Newt, and so the combat became very personal. And I think that was one of the things that started this movement. But over time, I think it's become political and as well as personal, much more political and personal than it used to be.
Now, you said raising Cain with the Democrats. You wielded the gavel at the for the Government Reform and Oversight Committee, and you used that to raise a number of investigations, particularly the Clinton administration,
right,
both people and policies. What do you see as your legacy of that tenure?
Well, I think Bill Clinton, President Clinton, and Hillary, Secretary of State, probably still don't like me very much. I was chairman of the Government Reform and Oversight Committee during the time that we were investigating Whitewater. We were investigating campaign contributions that came from sources outside the United States and from nefarious people. And I think there was an awful lot to that. We had people testify like Johnny Chung and Charlie Wang, and those people testified that they had contributed money in order to gain favor at the White House. There was also other illegal contributions that we found from, we believe, the Communist Chinese. One fellow said that they'd come in through a restaurant, the kitchen, in Hong Kong, and they met with one of the gentlemen I referred to and said, "We like your president, we want to contribute to his campaign." And the fellow that said that was the head of the, allegedly the head of the Chinese Communist, the equivalent of our CIA. Now, these were people who were under oath who swore to this, and we also had over 100 people take the Fifth Amendment or flee the country. So I think there was a lot there. That's not to say that President Clinton didn't do some good things. I think that he worked with Newt Gingrich. We got out from under some difficult financial problems at that time. But I do believe, and I still believe, there was some illegal activities that took place, and we weren't able to get the job done. I always said that Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General, was the greatest blocker than anybody I ever saw at the National Football League. One thing I learned is that if you're the president and you want to really protect your legacy and your office, you want to make absolutely sure you have an Attorney General that will protect your back. And Janet Reno, God bless her, she did that very effectively. I sent 5 criminal referrals over there that I thought were ironclad when I was chairman, and she never moved on any of them. So, as I said before, I think the Clinton administration did a lot of good things, but I also think there were things that were done wrong that should have been pursued, and that's why we pursued them so diligently. And of course, I was criticized roundly. They made fun of a lot of the things we did, but that goes with the territory.
And when you want to explain to people about the investigations power of Congress and what role it plays generally, how do you explain that role of Congress?
Well, the Congress has the responsibility to ferret out waste, fraud, and abuse in government and in the executive branch. We're supposed to oversee that. Most committees in the Congress and the House don't do a really good job of it. When I became chairman, Newt charged me with the responsibility of really being aggressive in a number of investigations. I investigated Health and Human Services, the Food and Drug Administration, the FBI, as well as the White House. And we found that there were people in jail for 30-some years for crimes they didn't commit. J. Edgar Hoover knew about it, and like Mr. Joe Salvati of Massachusetts. So there were a lot of things that were wrong in government that weren't readily known. And so when we had our investigations, we were very, very aggressive. Now, what did we do? I issued over 1,200 subpoenas. I don't think anybody will ever touch that record. I'm not sure it's a good record, but it was one I thought was necessary. And it's because we wanted to get to the bottom of a lot of these things. And I think it paid off. And I will tell you this, we not only put pressure on the Clinton administration, I put pressure on the Bush administration and his chief counsel at the White House as well, in particular where the Salvati case was involved. And so I know you've probably heard of Whitey Bulger, who was just captured recently. His brother, Billy Bulger, was one of the people we had before our committee in Boston working on that Bulger investigation. So there were a lot of things we did. And that's the responsibility of Congress. The oversight of the executive branch and the agencies of government is extremely important, because no matter what you believe, what you think, there's going to be waste, there's going to be fraud, and there's going to be criminal activity and abuse in any government. And you have to really take a hard look at it.
Well, with that hyper-partisanship you were talking about earlier and some of its root causes, did your aggressive stance for investigation contribute to that? And if so, is that the price that you think is necessary to pay?
I think that it did contribute to that, because you're really stepping on toes. When you go after the President of the United States, you'd better have armor plate. And you'd better realize they're going to do whatever it takes to negate what you say and to put a stop to your investigation, which they did. And they contacted the head of my golf team when I was in high school, girls I dated in school. They went into everything. So I think that's one of the things you have to expect when you're really aggressive. And it does cause problems. But nevertheless, I have no regrets about it. I feel if you're going to do your job and do it to the best of your ability and live up to your commitments to the Constitution, you have to be ready to take the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. What
did you learn through that experience about the powers of the executive and the powers of the Congress?
As I said before, I learned that the President of the United States, if he has an Attorney General that will really stand behind him, I think there's very little that can be accomplished as far as bringing illegal activity to the fore and to justice. Richard Nixon, he went to his Attorney General during Watergate and didn't get his support. Had he gotten his support, I don't think he would have left office. Conversely, when we went after Bill Clinton and had over 100 people take the Fifth Amendment or flee the country, and we had, I felt, very strong evidence of some illegal activities, Janet Reno really protected him, and I think that ended up helping him a lot. But I want to point out, and if Bill or Hillary's paying any attention, I would say to them, they did some good things. And I think that the economy of the country was helped because he worked with Newt Gingrich. So there were some positives. But nevertheless, I still feel like there were some things that were wrong that we were pursuing.
While we're talking about presidents, you've served in Congress under 5 of them. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you could reflect on which of those presidents and their administrations did the best job of relationship building with the Congress.
No question. The greatest man I ever met and the greatest president was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had a heart, and he had a determination that I have not seen in anybody in the White House, or for that matter anybody in Congress since. He was a soft-spoken fellow who was so underrated it wasn't funny. And let me tell you a story about his heart. my father tried to kill my mother when I was a boy. That's one of the reasons why I've never liked bullies. And that's why I was very aggressive in a lot of things I did. I think my father had a lot to do with that. But he went to prison, and my mother waited on tables for 18 years, and she married a fellow who went to the 7th grade only, and he worked in a foundry. Very nice man. And when I entered politics when I was very young, I said, one of these days I'm going to be a congressman, and when I am, I'm going to take you in the front door of the White House and introduce you to the President of the United States. And my mother and my stepfather looked at each other and thought, yeah, they'd never met anybody in politics. Well, 18 years later, I got elected to the Congress. And I called Reagan's secretary, and I told her the story. And she said, let me see if I can arrange for you to meet with the President and your mom and dad. So they arranged it, and Mom and Kenny drove out in their Corvette, and we parked behind the White House, and I arranged to walk around to the front door, like I promised, and we took them in the front door and went into the Oval Office. And President Reagan came over, and he put his arm around me and said, Miss Kelly, I want to tell you your son is one of the brightest young congressmen we have, and he's going to do great things. And I know you had to wait on tables for 18 years, and Kenny, you worked in a foundry. And Danny, he called me Danny, Danny had to shine shoes. I know it was tough. He said, but we had those problems in my family, and isn't it great that we live in a country where you can achieve anything no matter what your background is? And all I could think of was, how does he know this stuff? And he had his secretary call my office to find out about me and my family. And from that moment on, when I walked out of that office, I would have done anything for that man, because he made my mother feel so happy. And she carried that picture with her until the day she died. And her favorite actor was Ronald Reagan.
So the lesson for that about relationships for presidents is the personal touch?
I think that's a big part of it. But it wasn't just a personal touch. I mean, he had goals like the Strategic Defense Initiative. I was the first one that defended him on the floor against a guy named Al Gore and Tom Downey. They were on the floor one night calling it Star Wars, and I was down there as a new congressman, and I went after them for about an hour. Back in those days, we had plenty of time on the floor. And Reagan wrote me a real nice personal letter the next day. So Reagan was very committed to what he wanted to do. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I mean, once he made up his mind, he was very strong in his position. But he was also very amenable to dealing with people where he could. He was not so hard-nosed that he wasn't willing to try to find a way to solve problems. He worked with Tip O'Neill, a very strong Democrat, liberal from Massachusetts, Speaker of the House, in order to solve the Social Security problem. And I'm not sure any other president would have been able to achieve what he did. Plus the economic growth with his tax cuts and everything. We had 20 years of growth because of him. So I think he had that real nice, soft personality, a very warm guy who knew what it was to be poor and to fight your way out of the difficult things. But he was also a man who had convictions, and he was willing to go to the mat if he had to. Good man, the best I knew.
Does the presidential nominating process bring candidates into the system with conviction, with the kind of skills that you think it takes to be a successful president?
I do not mean to disparage anybody who's run for office, but I think there's too many people running for office that are more concerned about politics and getting elected than doing what's really right. I feel like Ronald Reagan was one of those guys that had a commitment in his soul to do what he thought was best for the country and not to worry about being partisan all the time and being worried about the next election. And so I think right now we have too many people that when they run for office, they read the polls and they try to do what they think is going to get them elected instead of saying really what they believe. And I think it's time now that we need people who will speak out forcefully about what they believe, because I think the people of America are hungry for that. They want somebody that's going to say very clearly, this is what I believe. You may disagree, but I'm going to do my best to achieve these things, and then stick to it. And I think I had people in my campaigns over the years come up to me and say, Danny, I don't agree with you on this, but I think you're a straight shooter and I'm going to vote for you anyhow. Now, I'm not holding myself up as any paragon of virtue, but I sensed from that people are willing to give you a chance if they think you're a straight shooter.
You made reference to using floor time as a way to achieve policy discussions. I'm wondering, if you look back in the archives of C-SPAN, you have spent a lot of time on the floor over the years. Some members never go to the floor. How have you seen the floor as a resource as a member of Congress?
It used to be that you could go down and get an hour special order, and you could do it all night long. A guy named Gonzalez from Texas used to start with an hour, and he would start talking about the space program and end up by talking about chuckles in his district. I mean, he'd cover the spectrum. They decided that they needed to limit that, and so they started changing it where we had to quit by midnight, which was all right. But I think we've gone too far. I think that members need to speak their mind on personal time more than just 5 minutes in the morning and maybe 1 minute at night, because many times there are things that need to be illuminated with a little extra time, and getting 2 minutes during a debate, or 1 minute at the end of the day, or 5 minutes in the morning sometimes doesn't get it done. So I'd like to see that revisited.
Many members complain or hearken back in a positive sense to the time when members used to stay around on the weekend. They'd go out to dinner with one another.
Yes.
Their families would get together. What changed that?
I think the acrimony that started with the Jim Wright case, and then going after Newt, which was a payback. I think those things were the seeds. Most people probably wouldn't remember that because it's a long time ago, but I think those were the seeds for a lot of that. You know, we're not friends anymore. I still get together with some people for dinner once in a while, but very rarely is it with my Democrat colleagues. There's some Democrats, Charlie Rangel, I really like. There's a lot of guys that I like on the other side of the aisle, and we get together once in a while. But it's not like it used to be. It should be better. And
in any sense, did congressional scheduling practices change that? So people were anxious to get home on weekends, or the need to raise more money to run?
Oh, my goodness. You know, when I first ran, I spent $250,000 or thereabouts in my first campaign. Now it costs $1.5 million to $2 million. And members have to raise money for their party. The NRCC for the Republicans, the DCCC for the Democrats. And members spend an inordinate amount of time over at their headquarters, the NRCC or the DCCC, calling people, begging for money. And I think you spend maybe a third to half of your time asking people for money. And that should not be the main objective of our job. We should be doing the job for the people instead of worrying about raising money all the time. I don't know what the answer is. Maybe limiting the terms that a campaign goes on, the time limits. I don't know what it is. I know you can't limit the funding because of the First Amendment, but it's gone way beyond the pale. I mean, we have state representatives now that are spending $750,000 for a House seat in Indiana. We've gone way beyond where we should.
In addition to your long service on the Government Oversight and Reform Committee, you also have been on Foreign Affairs.
Yes, for 30 years.
And somewhat early association was with Jesse Helms on the so-called Helms-Burton Act.
Right.
How did that alliance come together? Let's start with that part of the story.
Well, I was always a strong anti-communist, and I never liked Fidel Castro. And so I became chairman of the subcommittee on Western Hemisphere. And I worked with some of my Cuban-American friends, Ileana Ross-Leighton, who is now chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and others, Bob Menendez, who's in the Senate now, and Lincoln Diaz-Balart. And we worked very hard to put sanctions on Castro to try to bring down that regime. We weren't able to get it done until a Soviet MiG flown by a Cuban pilot shot down the Brothers to the Rescue flotilla flight that flew over and dropped leaflets on Cuba. They shot a couple of them down. They didn't get them all. One of them made it back. And as a result, that created a huge furor. Bill Clinton was not going to sign the bill for the Helms-Burton law, the sanctions on Cuba, but he was put in a very difficult position after that shoot down. And so we got it passed, and I was the author in the House, and Jesse Helms was the author in the Senate. And we worked together on the bill along with my Cuban-American friends.
The regime is still around all these years
Yes.
later,
Yes.
And at the time a number of our allies protested the bill, the law. So what in the rearview mirror, how effective was it overall, and do you feel good about that particular?
Well, it shows that the repression in Cuba is so strong and the ability of Fidel Castro to reach out to some of his quote unquote friends around the world, that he's been able to circumvent in large part our sanctions. I think we ought to continue to do everything we can to bring freedom to the people of Cuba, but the Helms-Burton law was not as effective as I would have liked.
Another issue that you are very much associated with is autism.
Yes.
How did that get started?
My grandson, Christian, was a very normal child, and when he was about 18 months to 2 years old, he got 9 shots in one day, 7 of which had thimerosal in them. Mercury was in thimerosal. It's a preservative. Never been tested. In 1929, it was tested on 29 people who had meningitis, all of whom died from the meningitis. And so they said the thimerosal had no impact on that. So they started using it in ophthalmologic solutions, mercurochrome methylate, and they started using it in vaccinations. When children only got a few vaccinations, it didn't have a huge impact. But then they started getting as many as 25 to 30 before they go to the first grade. And my grandson got 9 in one day, and he, in a very short time, became autistic, banging his head against the wall, had diarrhea and constipation, and he wouldn't look at you, couldn't do anything. It was terrible. He's done much better. He's doing very well, incidentally. But because of that, I was not aware of autism at all, but I was chairman of the committee that did the investigations. So I started looking into it with Health and Human Services and the Food and Drug Administration. And that's where I had 4 years of hearings on that, and I became convinced that mercury, women who are pregnant shouldn't eat fish with mercury in it. There's a lot of things that you shouldn't do, shouldn't touch any mercury, and yet we're injecting it into our children and adults in the form of vaccinations. And the brain tissue, according to the scientists that we had before the committee, is very soft, and it's hard to chelate or get that mercury out of there once it gets into the brain. And so, and we also had the University of Calgary in Canada send us information that showed very clearly how it affects the brain cells. And so I'm convinced, and I still will be working on this after I leave Congress, to get mercury out of everything that goes into the human body. I think it not only causes autism and other neurological problems with children, I think it also is a contributing factor to Alzheimer's. Because when you get a flu shot or get any shot, it's in a 10-shot vial, and it has mercury in it. And so I just think I'll tell you that right now. And my colleagues really don't know it. But we used to have 1 in 10,000 children that were autistic. Granted, we're looking at it differently as far as how we keep track of that. But now it's 1 in 88. We have an absolute epidemic, and we've got to find out the reasons. I don't think it's the only reason, but I think the mercury in vaccinations is a contributing factor. After
the 4 years of investigations, in addition to raising public awareness, did anything else come out of that effort for you? I mean, was anything changed about the...
Yes, we were able... the FDA won't tell you that we were the reason, but we were able to get the thimerosal out of all the children's vaccines but 3. So I think that was a giant achievement. They have also tried to sneak legislation through that will protect them, the pharmaceutical companies, against class action lawsuits dealing with that. We've been able to stop that, but it's a never-ending case of constant vigilance to make sure that they don't protect themselves. I met with the leaders of the various pharmaceutical companies, the CEOs of a whole bunch of them, and I said, if you will put more money into the Vaccine Injury Compensation Fund, which is supposed to compensate people who are damaged by these things, and if you'll also get mercury out of all the vaccinations and put the shots into single-shot vials, which do not require a preservative, then I will support and work my tail off to get legislation passed that will protect you against class action lawsuits from this issue. They wouldn't do anything with it. And so we will continue the fight. And one day, someday 10, 15, you're still very young, but someday 10 or 15 years from now, somebody will say, do you remember Dan Burton? And they'll say, we finally got mercury out of all those things. Mercury is toxic to the human body, the human neurological system. We need to get every form of mercury out, and in particular, stop the vaccinations with thimerosal.
We now have them in our light bulbs, mercury in our light bulbs.
Yes, and I think that's a terrible mistake, because they'll tell you right now, if you drop one and break it, they put all kinds of things that you have to do to protect yourself from being exposed to that mercury. We shouldn't do that. There's other ways. I mean, we got LED bulbs. I've got a whole bunch of those, and they work fine. They do not contain mercury to my knowledge. So why are we using those things?
Back to autism. When you look online to do research about you and autism, you've got the great support of the autism community. Another aspect of it, though, is on where we are today with the fiscal cliff and the size of the federal debt. And you, over time, with your attendance to this issue, have brought lots and lots of federal dollars to autism, and including money going back into your own district where there's an autism center at the university.
Yeah, they wanted to name that after me, and I had them name it after my grandson, the Christian Sarkeen Autism Center.
So square that away, your personal interest as a member of Congress and an important issue, with where we are today on the size of the federal debt and how those people should think about those two things.
Yes, we should. But we should prioritize our spending. We spend an inordinate amount of money on the AIDS epidemic, which I have no problem with. We need to fight AIDS. We need to find out how to stop it and cure it. But at the same time, we're spending a huge amount of money on that and not a great deal, comparatively, on autism or other neurological diseases. We are spending more than when I first started this crusade, but we certainly need to spend more. When you go from 1 in 10,000 children who are autistic, when you see the huge increase in the number of people dying from Alzheimer's, and you realize that they're putting mercury into human beings, and that's a contributing factor to these neurological problems, we need to spend more money finding out how to stop that. And we're not spending nearly enough. We spend, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 million dollars a year, maybe 50 or 60 million. But NIH gets billions of dollars. And this is an epidemic that must be dealt with. If you have an autistic child, that child will probably live to be 70 years old. You may not be able to take care of that child past, say, 18 or 20. We have people that are afraid to be in the room with their child when they get to be 16 because they go out of control. They're afraid they lock the door between them. People are losing their homes. They're mortgaging their homes to help their kids, and it doesn't work. And these are going to be a huge burden, not only on their families, but on the taxpayers over the next 50 years. So we need to get to the bottom of it as quickly as possible. All these things are important. Cancer is very important. My first wife died of cancer. AIDS is important. But autism is an epidemic that's going to stick with us for the next 50 years. And we've got to deal with it.
So we have about 4 minutes left in our conversation with you. But with regard to the debt, the state of the U.S. economy, you have some important votes to cast before the lame duck session is over. What is your level of confidence about the future of the U.S. economy right now?
I'm not really optimistic. I think that we may have a short-term solution. The president wants to spend more money, and I understand that. He also wants to raise taxes on people over $250,000, and I think he'll get part of that, because if we don't pass it now, the end of the year will come, we'll reach the fiscal cliff, he'll come back with a bill that says we're going to give everybody a tax cut under $250,000. Who's going to vote against that? You see? So he has the ability to wait. That's number one. Number two, I think that we are trillions of dollars in the hole, not just 16 trillion, but 60, 70 trillion in the hole. And this is going to come back to haunt us. And I think down the road we will have a severe economic problem. I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's a solution. But unless something radical changes very quickly, I think we're going to see severe economic problems and probably very high inflation.
You made the decision not to run again. What will you miss most about Congress?
I will miss the camaraderie. I said the other night, I was one of the founders of the Republican Study Committee, which started with 4 of us, me, Ernie Istook, John Doolittle, and Sam Johnson of Texas, one of my real heroes. And we started with 4, now there's over 170 members. And I was talking to them the other night. They were honoring me as one of the founders. And I said, you know, when I was 19 years old and in the Army, I was lying on my bunk. And I was looking around the room at all the guys I'd gone through all that hell with and basic training. And I was thinking, I'll never see these guys again. And I'm really going to miss them. And I'm going to miss everybody in Congress. I'm going to miss a lot of them, all of them.
What will you not miss?
I will not miss the feeling that you're not accomplishing as much as you should. There's so much we could be doing that we're not getting done. And but I wish my colleagues, I wish all of you the best. Keep fighting. I'll be rooting for all of you.
What would you like, in a few words, your legacy to be of this 30 years? What do you most want to be remembered for?
I would like for people to think he might have been a bulldog, but he was a man who believed in honesty and integrity and the things that were right for this country. And regardless of how difficult it was, he kept to those principles. I hope they'll look at me like that. I know a lot of people think I'm a bad guy and did a bunch of goofy things, but I hope they think I'm a man of integrity.
What do you plan to do next?
I'm not planning on lobbying, but what I would like to do is maybe represent some international companies. I've been on foreign affairs for 30 years, been chairman or ranking Republican on all the subcommittees, and I think I can help some international companies and maybe down the road some countries. So I'd like to be active in that area.
Do you plan to stay in Washington or go back to Indiana?
It depends on what kind of business I can acquire. I have a beautiful wife, Samia. I want to spend more time with her. I want to get my golf handicap back down to single digits. But I would like to spend a little time in D.C., yes.
Have you thought about preservation of your papers,
yes.
Your memoirs? What are you going to be doing with all that?
I'm sending most of them to Indiana University, particularly the autism information, because I think that's extremely important. And I've also, the Indiana Historical Society is going to get some of my papers, and I hope that they find a good use for them.
Well, in closing, when you look back over the arc of 30 long years, which, as we said beforehand, went by very quickly, what were the best years of the 30?
Oh, gosh. There was good in all of them. I think the best years, from my standpoint, was when I was chairman, because even the people that worked for me, they all said, we felt like we were accomplishing something. We felt like we were fighting the good fight. And I think that's one of the things I hold the most dear, was that we were able to put on the gloves, grab the sword, and go out and fight for the things we thought was right.
Congressman Dan Burton, thank you so much for spending time with us, reflecting back on your years in Washington.